It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Ivan from the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, where he is a senior research scientist. The title of his talk is The Missing Lynx: Restoration, Research, and Ongoing Work to Conserve the Canada Lynx in Colorado. Jake has earned his master's from the University of Montana, his PhD from CSU, where he has been also working with them for the last 6 or 8 years, I think. He has done a lot of research on the lynx and the prey, the snowshoe hare. So his current research interests include impacts of bark beetle, outbreaks on lynx, snowshoe hares, and other wildlife, impacts on timber harvests, and large-scale monitoring of rare and elusive species. Finally, let me mention that Jake will talk about a topic that has symbolic importance for us. Several years ago, our university, our college, chose a new mascot, and it was a lynx, Milo the lynx. Today, Jake will tell us the real life story of reintroducing the lynx in Colorado. Without further ado, Jake, tell us all about the lynx.
All right. Okay, am I sharing? Can everyone hear that? Or hear me and see the presentation?
I think I can hear you in your presentation, your PowerPoint.
That's great.
Okay, great. Then let's get moving then. Well, thank you, Rudy, for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I always enjoy talking about lynx. I always enjoy talking about our research, and really enjoy talking about the reintroduction effort, because I think that's just a good story. No matter who you are, where you are, especially for us in Colorado, it seems like one of those sort of rare, large-scale conservation success things that most people feel pretty good about. So happy to talk about that. Maybe most especially because we just finished last year was the 20th anniversary of when we initially started this project, reintroducing lynx. So it's not ancient history yet, but certainly it happened a while ago, probably before most folks were in grad school and maybe before many of you were even in your faculty position. So it's worth revisiting just to get a sense of what we did and why we did it and how and what we learned along the way, which hopefully you'll find interesting. And then about halfway through, I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit toward more current topics, what we're doing now in terms of research to try to address some ongoing pertinent issues, and also our current monitoring effort to try to keep tabs on this population that we put back and give you a sense of how things are going on that front. So with that, let's get started. And where I wanted to start was way back at the beginning. So this is a map of historical occurrences of lynx as we know them. This comes from a book chapter written by Kevin McKelvey with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, who did all of the hard work of trying to parse through museum specimens, old trapping records, other observations, figure out which of those might actually be reasonable and actually happened and represent lynx, and which of them were probably unreasonable and unreliable. And this is the map that we came up with. And as you can see, we have records of lynx going back to probably the mid 1800s or so. And so because of these kinds of records, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife has always sort of considered lynx to be a species that was native to the state. And that's an important piece here. Although that is a source of contention and a little bit of question, we can get into that after the talk if you're interested. Fast forward a bit to 1997. At this point in time, lynx had been listed as state endangered for a couple of decades. They were listed, largely due to widespread predator control activities, but we think sort of drove them to the brink. There wasn't a whole lot of regulation on trapping in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a lot of widespread just predator poisoning. And in many cases, we have records of, even government-sponsored trapping, just sort of generally for predators as well. So we think that was one of the main events that sort of pushed lynx onto this trajectory that they weren't able to recover from. They're relatively rare, just naturally. They aren't very productive, and it probably doesn't take a whole lot of this kind of activity to push them toward the edge and get them to a place where they can't pull themselves out. The last known lynx was actually trapped in Colorado near the Vail ski area, 1974. From 78 to 97, our agency conducted 11 different surveys to try to document lynx presence in the state. There were a few tracks that turned up that may have been lynx, maybe not, we're not sure, but certainly the conclusion from all of that work was if there are lynx present, it's only a handful of individuals and certainly too few to consider to be anything viable. So the decision was made in 1999 to actually try to reintroduce this species to the state. Why did we do this? The main reason why is A, we didn't think they were here anymore, and B, we did think they were a native species, which leads us to this first bullet. We have a sort of a direct mandate. Our mission in life is to ensure the long-term viability of native fish and wildlife in the state. That's why we're here. And given that that was a native species, it was extirpated, we think, due largely to human actions and intervention, that we felt like it was our duty to try to get them back if we could. The second bullet is important. There's no sense in trying to reintroduce something if the factors that caused their demise are still operating. That seems like a dumb idea, but in this case, we felt like the predator control predator poisoning issues were no longer really an issue. And so if we put them back, they had a decent chance of sticking around here. Because we also did feel like we have lots of good habitat. We have a fairly decent snowshoe hare population, and they might do well if given the chance. And then the third bullet is also important, just given the geography of Colorado and where we fit in terms of the range of lynx. We're at the very southern tip of lynx range naturally. We are also separated. We're kind of an island down here. The next best lynx stuff is in northwest Wyoming, southwest Montana. There's a lot of sagebrush between us and them. And so we thought that natural recolonization was probably not super likely given our level of isolation. So that's why we decided to do this. Excuse me. The overarching goal was to establish a self-sustaining, viable population of lynx in the state. We had numerous sort of check marks along the way, benchmarks that we wanted to be able to check off in terms of getting us to this goal, but ultimately this is what we were trying to accomplish. To do this, we had to get lynx from somewhere. So we went to places where lynx are naturally more abundant. And here's a map of the numbers of lynx that we gathered from various places. So there's 4 provinces there in the state of Alaska. You can also see the numbers that were released by year. All of those into Colorado. Basically, the way that we work this is we work pretty closely with local trapping associations on the ground with local trappers, and worked out a deal where we paid them just a little bit more for a live lynx than they would have gotten to sell the pelt on the open market. So that's how we were able to get the animals. They kept them in the traps. We had local veterinarians go check them out and get them on a plane to DIA. And then we got them out into Colorado eventually. But we certainly did a lot more than just open the gates like I showed you in the one picture and release a bunch of cats and wish them good luck. There were a lot of things that we wanted to try to learn about lynx along the way, so that we could better manage this population and try to keep them around. So first and foremost, one of the things we really wanted to learn about was we try to document their distribution in the state, okay? if you're putting a bunch of animals in a place and they all just disperse and run off and don't stay where you want them to stay, then that's no good. So we wanted to make sure that that wasn't happening. But we also wanted to get an idea of where these animals were settling and what types of places in Colorado they thought were best for them. We certainly wanted to try to understand habitat use, movements at different scales, diet as well, again, just to try to facilitate conservation and management into the future. We know a lot about these subjects. There's been a lot of good lynx research done all across lynx range further north. But you know, Colorado is not the Yukon territory. There's some pretty stark differences, and we weren't sure how well what we had learned in the literature from, say, Yukon territory would translate to Colorado. So we wanted to learn, you know, how lynx acted when they got down here. And finally, and maybe most importantly, is we wanted to estimate survival, do a good job of estimating productivity, and then use our estimates of those two parameters to try to get an idea of what population growth looked like, so that we knew, you know, whether this was a viable, self-sustaining enterprise or not. Sort of three broad methods that we used to try to get after these objectives. First of all, there was a lot of telemetry involved, most of it in the form of radio collars or satellite collars of some type. So this female on the left has a pretty hefty dual function satellite telemetry collar on her. So part of that collar is just an old school VHF beacon that just beeps, and you can listen to that on a radio, follow it around on an airplane or on the ground and figure out where animals are at, and in that respect. But part of it was satellite telemetry as well. And this was, you know, state of the art in '99 and 2000. But I will say that this is not anywhere near the type of technology as today's, you know, GPS units and GPS collars. It's the old Argos system, which again is satellite based, but works very differently from today's GPS system. Because of that, you know, we were able to get, you know, lots of locations on these animals at all times of day and nights. We were able to set up duty cycles and collect information when we wanted it, but a lot of that information was not very precise. Some of these locations, you know, are within a few hundred meters of where the lynx, the individual actually was. Many of the locations are a kilometer or 2 kilometers away. So the precision wasn't great, but it worked pretty well for what we wanted. And again, at the time, that was the best that was out there. Another method that we made extensive use of was snow tracking. So we would use the telemetry to try to figure out where individuals had settled, and then go find them on the ground, or rather find their tracks on the ground in the winter, and do a lot of backtracking. In fact, I added up all of the miles that our crews backtracked over the years that we did this, and we actually had folks that basically snowshoed from here to Chicago and back, following lynx around the mountains of the San Juan. So we collected an enormous data set in terms of more details on the types of habitats that lynx were using, their movement rates, how far they would move in a day, and maybe most importantly, I don't know if you can see my cursor on your screen or not, but you would find kill sites here, like this photo in the upper right, okay, which is incredibly valuable. That's how we figured out what they were eating, how much they were eating. This is a typical snowshoe hare kill site. When they eat a snowshoe hare, they basically consume the entire thing, the head, the bones, the guts, everything, except for, you can see one hind foot left here and another hind foot left here. I don't know why, but all lynx everywhere, interestingly enough, when they consume hares, they leave the feet. I don't know why that is. Another interesting little aside that generally people don't know about with snow tracking, this photo on the bottom right that you can see, that's my glove for scale. And this is what we call the compression signature of the snow. Okay, so typically when we think of snow tracking, we think of prints on the surface of the snow, and certainly that's helpful. But prints can get blown in, prints can melt out, other animals can walk in prints. What we often use as a confirmatory measure for tracks and figure out what we're actually following is the compression signature underneath the snow. So when you or I or an animal steps on the snow, we compress that, our weight does, and then that compressed snow freezes and you get these signatures underneath there. So you can dig these things out And this is a very unique compression signature. Lynx have big feet. They have nice built-in snowshoes. They're highly adapted for these deep, soft snow environments. And because of that, the compression signature is very shallow and wide. It just looks like a disc or a donut. Okay, so here the print is on the top, and this is the compression here. Anything else that's up there walking around, like a coyote or a fox or a cougar or a bobcat, has a very different compression signature. It's not nearly that wide, and it's much, much, much deeper. Okay, so their weight gets distributed straight down into the snow as opposed to out. So interesting little aside. I love snow tracking a lot, and you learn a lot, but it's an interesting sort of pastime for me as well. And then, of course, the other main method that we used was capture. Okay, and the main reason for this is we needed to have as many lynx as possible on the air, because we use those telemetry locations for all kinds of learning that we did. And at that time, the battery life on the collars was only about 12 to 18 months. So we tried to capture as many lynx as we could every winter, just to swap out collars and keep a good sample on the air. So that's how we did stuff. And let's take a look at what we learned relative to those objectives that I mentioned. Okay. So here's the first slide I'll throw up. This is every single lynx location that we ever collected from those animals that were released. And this slide usually results in some wide-eyed looks or maybe a gasp. It is kind of incredible. It's 218 lynx, and this is where they went. First thing you notice is that when lynx really want to, they're very capable of moving long distances over a short period of time, and even through what we consider some pretty inhospitable habitat. Okay, so we had lynx make it to Iowa. We had lynx make it to Northeast Nebraska, Northern Montana, Idaho, Zion National Park, and many times back again. So it's pretty incredible what they can do. The longest distance that we observed was 1,100 miles, straight line distance. This was an individual male who we released and actually set up a nice home range down by Silverton, fathered several litters down there, and then we just lost track of them. We figured the collar died, or maybe the individual died. And then one day we got a call from a trapper in Nordig, Alberta, that said, I got a lynx in my trap, and it had a collar on it, and that collar has your name on it. So that's a pretty incredible journey there, I think. 1,100 mile straight line. I wish the collar was working when he did it, so we could see what the path was and how long it took him, but pretty incredible if they want to go. The other thing I find really interesting is Nordig, Alberta, the destination. It was not very far actually from where we originally trapped him to bring him down to Colorado. So I don't know if he somehow knew he was headed home or just was wandering, but it's interesting to think about for sure. And that's all well and good, but certainly these big movements is not what we wanted and not what we anticipated. And honestly, that's not a very accurate picture of what happened. If we go through the process of building a population level sort of utilization distribution and only focus at the inner 95% of all locations across all individuals, this is what that looks like. Okay, so if you take that previous slide and just cut off the tails of the distribution, this is what you're left with. Which is more what we anticipated and more what we really wanted from this reintroduction effort. So these are the places where lynx spend all their time. We released them all in the San Juans in the southwest part of the state. Several found their way into other habitat in the Swatch range. The dark, warmer colors there represent lots of lynx locations, and the cooler colors were used less. But in terms of documenting distribution and having lynx end up in places that made sense, this felt pretty good to us. This is what we had hoped for and anticipated, so that was good. Their habitat use, okay, so within those polygons, what were they actually selecting to use is mostly this kind of thing, okay? So you find lynx, high elevation, subalpine forest where there's deep, soft snow, and it's basically a spruce fir habitat type. That's what lynx like. They really like the multi-layered, multi-story kinds of stuff. So these older stands where there's a bunch of old trees, but a bunch of new young trees and medium-sized trees and downwood and a lot of structure. And I think the main reason for that is, as you'll see later, that feeds into their denning habits a bit, but mostly this is good hare habitat. Hares are tied to understory cover. They need cover close to the ground at all times of the year. Even as that snow elevator is moving up and down, they need cover at that snow surface. And so these multi-layered types of stands are perfect for hares, and I think that's why they're perfect for lynx. We've also found that lynx like to use sort of these old growth kinds of stands, but they can also take advantage of multi-layered forests that result from management as well. Okay, so at a broader scale, if one stand is managed at a certain point in time one way, and the stand next to it, a different type of management at a different point in time, and you get this sort of mosaic of layering across a landscape, that's something that's very usable for lynx also. Here's just another picture of a different forest, but having those young trees and that structure close to the ground is an important thing for lynx. In terms of home ranges, what we found is that sort of the average home range size of a reproductively active female is about 75 square kilometers. For males, it's bigger than that, usually 100 to 150 or so. Males usually have 1 or 2 females within their home range. So roughly the lynx home range size is about the size of Broomfield County, just north of you guys by 25. So for scale, that's kind of what it looks like in real life. This is what space use for a year might look like. This was a female. This is a Google Earth image. The Rio Grande Reservoir is in the center of that image on the right-hand side. So this is the upper reaches of the Rio Grande River. And generally, that 75 square kilometer home range encompasses a couple of large drainages and 3 or 4 sort of side drainages off of that. So this is very typical. As you can see, most of those points are concentrated in that heavy dark timber, those bands of spruce fir, especially on these north-facing slopes in that upper valley. We had a PhD student who spent a lot of time building this sophisticated Bayesian movement model. And one of the things she was able to do was to pull out different speeds and different types of movements. And I thought this was interesting from a conservation standpoint. So what I showed you before is sort of home range level stuff, but what she pulled out here is all the high speed, very directed movements. So not moving slow, not torturous paths where lynx are clearly hunting or trying to find mates. This is where they're trying to go somewhere. So I view these as more dispersal type patterns or exploratory kinds of movements. And indeed, these were mostly made by animals that weren't reproductively active. They often pick up and leave during the summer and just go. So a lot of those points you saw outside of the state were animals that lived here and picked up and left in the summer and made big, what we called walkabouts, exploratory movements, and very often would end up by October or November right back in the same drainage from where they had started. Even if they had walked all the way to Utah, they would often find their way right back. But what you can see here from the image on the left is we stacked up all of these high-speed movements across all of the animals and built sort of a probability surface of where do these movements happen. And clearly there's a nice corridor that runs from the San Juan Mountains up the spine of the Rockies there, the Swatch Range over into the 10-mile Mosquito Range. They cross I-70 just east of the tunnel, kind of at the Bakerville exit, up over Berthoud Pass, and then extends up into the Rewa Mountains at the border. On the right-hand side, this is sort of a zoomed out version. You can really see the dark movement corridor moving north-south through Colorado. And you can also make out sort of these, look like jet contrails or something of other movement paths or probable movement paths of these animals that went other places. So that I think is important just from a population standpoint and conservation genetics kinds of standpoint, and making sure that various habitats in the state remain connected. Those habitats and those places underneath this movement corridor are probably a bit more important to conserve than say habitats in other places. Diet-wise, what we found is about 70% of what lynx eat in Colorado is snowshoe hares on average, these guys. Very typical of lynx. I'm sure you've all in your basic ecology textbooks have read about the relationship between lynx and hares, and that doesn't seem to be much different here than it is anywhere else. About the only other thing that they eat are red squirrels, okay? about 27% of the diet. A couple of things are important to consider though. So let's dig down into this a little bit further. So here's a paper we wrote a few years ago. Here's the 70 and 27 in terms of percent in the diet that I just showed you. And that's on average over about 10 years of snow tracking. But what I want to show you is there's a fair amount of variability. So in some years, like these, in that upper blue box, you see that in terms of frequency of diet items, snowshoe hares are maybe 90% of the diet, and red squirrels, less than 10. And it's even higher if you consider this is biomass percentage, percent biomass in the parentheses, so it's even higher. But in other years, when snowshoe hares are less available, when their numbers go down, such as this middle blue box, maybe only 50, 60% of the diet is hares. And in that case, they fill in the balance with red squirrels. So hares are definitely what it's all about. They're incredibly important to lynx, and their importance we'll talk about even more in coming slides. And red squirrels are a secondary food source for sure, but red squirrels play an important role. They are the thing that get lynx through when the snowshoe hares are less available. So keep that in mind, because that will keep coming up as we move through the talk. Okay, survival is another thing that we wanted to get a handle on, and this is a bit of a busy figure. I apologize for that. And what we actually have modeled here is mortality. So we have mortality on the y-axis and the number of months since release on the x-axis. This upper dark black line is the mortality rate for individuals that did not stay in what we consider the study area. Okay, so the study area was basically the San Juans. Individuals who went outside of the San Juans had a higher mortality rate than those that stayed put. This lower black dark line with the squares in it is the mortality rate for individuals that stayed within the study area, and everything else then is confidence intervals. So what we see, whether you're in or you're out, well, certainly you survive better if you stay in than if you wandered out, is one thing. But regardless of whether you're in or you're out, your mortality rate is higher when you first hit the ground, which makes sense. But if you make it through the first, say, 6 months or a year, then your mortality rate really kind of levels off and is actually quite low, and survival is quite high, and actually right in line with demographic parameters for lynx that we find in other parts of their range. Okay, so in terms of survival, lynx in Colorado act a lot like lynx elsewhere. Same with the diet. The diet makeup in terms of majority hares is very typical of lynx elsewhere. Red squirrels being an alternative prey, very typical of lynx elsewhere. So far, lynx in Colorado are acting just like lynx everywhere else. In terms of productivity, these are what typical lynx dens might look like. So lynx do not do any digging, they don't do any excavating, they don't make their own den, they don't find a cave like Yogi Bear or a rock crevice or anything like that. What they do is they find the steepest, nastiest north-facing slope in their home range, and then find the nastiest blowdown within that, like you see pictured here, and they drop their kittens right in the middle of that, on the ground underneath all that downfall. These are the types of places that takes you half an hour to walk 100 yards kinds of things, because they're often jackstraw trees, 5, 6, 7 trees deep. So the kittens are definitely well protected and difficult to find for sure. In terms of productivity, we found the first lynx den in 2003. We found almost 50 total through 2010. Lynx on average in Colorado produce about 2 to 2.5 kittens per litter, which again is right in line with lynx productivity in other parts of their range. And importantly, we were able to document 3rd generation kittens in Colorado, okay, by the time we were all done with this. So what I mean by that is that we had individuals that we reintroduced that found each other and mated and produced kittens. Those kittens found other Colorado-born kittens and mated and produced kittens. And then that generation of Colorado-born kittens also mated and produced kittens. So we felt like that was a pretty good sign that we had this sort of conveyor belt of productivity going. And not only could we put lynx in Colorado and have them survive well, but they did well enough here that it seemed like they could sustain themselves in terms of reproduction as well. So that was a very encouraging sign for us as it unfolded. This is a figure from my dissertation. So I actually did my dissertation work on snowshoe hares in Taylor Park in the late 2000s as part of this project. I was working directly for Dr. Tanya Schenk, who had my position before me and was the main researcher who was in charge of collecting and interpreting and analyzing all the data that I've showed you thus far. What I'm showing you here in this graph is, I was working on the hare end of things. This is estimated snowshoe hare density through time on my study area and in the spruce fir habitat type. And you don't have to squint very hard or stare very hard at that figure to think, well, man, that looks like a part of a population cycle. And certainly we have even more evidence today than we did at that point in time that we're pretty confident that snowshoe hares do cycle down here at the far southern end of their range. That's been a question in the literature for a long time, but I think we know that they do. And clearly the amplitude here is not near what it is in, say, the Yukon Territory, but they definitely cycle. As I was conducting this work, Tanya and her crews every summer would be out looking for dens and looking for kittens and trying to document reproduction. After that first summer, when I had a decent number of hares and pretty high snowshoe hare density, her crews went out and looked, and they found quite a few dens and lots of kittens, record number of kittens, and everyone was feeling good about life and slapping themselves on the back, and things seemed to really be cruising along in terms of the productivity end of things. Summer of 2007, I'm estimating half the number of hares in my study area as there were the previous summer. And Tanya and her crews looked and looked and looked and looked and looked and could not find any dens at all and no kittens at all. Summer 2008, I'm showing density even lower than summer of 2007, and Tanya and her crews, again, to their credit, spent an incredible amount of time and effort looking and looking and looking and looking and could not find any dens, could not find any kittens. Last winter, my dissertation, 2009, I'm showing what looks like a rebound in hare density, and sure enough, the following summer, they were able to find dens and kittens again, okay? So this is also very typical of lynx, wherever lynx live. As I mentioned before, if I mentioned several times, as you probably know, snowshoe hares tend to be cyclic. When we get into a trough in the snowshoe hare cycle and snowshoe hares aren't as abundant on the landscape, lynx tend to switch, as I showed you, to a diet more heavy in red squirrels. That seems fine in terms of getting them through. They survive pretty well on a diet of red squirrels. They don't look emaciated. They look like they're in pretty good shape. But clearly, a diet heavy in red squirrels is not conducive to pulling off litters. Okay, so even in Canada, in the heart of good lynx country, when the snowshoe hares are gone and they feed more heavily on squirrels, reproduction generally shuts down or shuts completely off. And that's what we found here too. And again, this is going to be an important point. So remember this relationship for later on too, because this will keep coming up. It'll come up again. So when we got to the end of our 10 years or so, we had what we thought was pretty good survival / mortality data. We had a lot of good reproduction, productivity kinds of data, and we put that stuff together in a very simple population projection model, just a simple deterministic thing, and said, well, what if we start with 50 individuals of each sex? Doesn't really matter where you start and this kind of thing, and just project the population forward based on everything that we had estimated and observed to have happened in the previous 10 years, and this is what we got. So you go forward 20 years, you get sort of this low amplitude cycle in the lynx population, which is a direct function of the hare cycle. But what encouraged us is that each successive peak was projected to be a little bit higher than the previous peak, okay? And again, this is simple. There's no stochasticity built into this, but sort of our mean projection was that, as best we could tell, this population appeared to be stable, if not growing slightly. And that made us feel pretty good that we had, in fact, achieved what we wanted to in the very beginning, which was a self-sustaining and viable population of lynx in the state. So at this point in time, We declared victory, and all kinds of press releases. This from the Denver Post stating, you know, Lynx Reintroduction has been ruled a success in Colorado. And we did feel like, you know, for that initial effort of getting animals on the ground and making sure they stay here and they can survive well here, produce here, that's probably a true statement that that the reintroduction was a success in that respect. We immediately then pivoted toward trying to document the long-term success of it. It's nice to get things through the first decade, but we wanted to set up some long-term monitoring to make sure that this continued to be a success. That's when I came into the agency. This is my first assignment, was to try to figure out how to do this. What we decided early on is that our monitoring would focus, at least initially, we still hope to expand this statewide, but initially we would focus on our honey hole down here in the San Juans, okay? And we really wanted to get away from the intensive capturing, collaring, marking, recapturing, invading their dens, marking their kittens kinds of stuff. That's incredibly expensive. It's also invasive to animals, and we weren't sure it was really necessary anymore. So we decided up front we wanted to implement some sort of non-invasive monitoring scheme. And what we came up with was trying to monitor occupancy as a surrogate for sort of the status of this population. So now I've zoomed into the San Juans, and we demarcated the entire San Juans, all the good lynx habitat, into cells. Each one of those cells is a home ranged sized sample unit. We took a random sample from that whole entire population of cells. Those are the colored ones. And we decided what we would do is go into each of those cells on an annual basis and do some surveys, just simple presence absence surveys for lynx, and use that detection, non-detection information in an occupancy framework to try to estimate the total proportion of those cells that actually have lynx using them. And then we would monitor that metric through time. The idea being that if the number of cells estimated to be occupied is increasing, that's probably a good thing. Probably means that the underlying population is increasing. And conversely, if the estimated number of used cells is contracting and declining, that's probably not a good sign. Probably the underlying population is not doing well. You'll notice there's different colors here. We did a lot of research to try to figure out how best to detect lynx. They're not the easiest thing in the world to detect. They're kind of secretive, they're kind of rare. We found that the best technique is what's indicated by the blue cells, that's snow tracking. If you get good conditions and you can ride around on a snowmobile for at least 10 kilometers and cover a couple of quadrants of selected cell, then you have about a 70 to 80% chance of detecting lynx, finding their tracks if they are in fact there, is what we found. And that's actually pretty good. So we wanted to do that everywhere we could, but clearly you can't snowmobile around in wilderness areas. There are other places where it just isn't that safe or that accessible, or not very efficient to do that. And so the next best thing we came up with was using remote cameras, and those are the cells you see colored in orange are our camera cells. Okay, so two different kinds of sampling happening, but we're both going into the same model to try to estimate the overall occupancy probability for this area. These are what the camera setups look like. We use Reconyx cameras. These are the old style here. They're set fairly high to accommodate accumulating snow. Excuse me. They're pointed at a lure tree about 8 meters away that has a chunk of lure stuck into the bark about 1 meter up, and another chunk of lure stuck into the bark about 2 meters up. And what we do here is we deploy all these cameras, so 150 of them or so, 4 cameras in each of those orange units. We hike out there and deploy these things in the fall. That's actually happening right now as we speak. Then we walk away, but we leave them all winter. This has been set up so that the sensors on the camera can capture lynx that are at the base of the tree in the snow-free season, and also so that the sensors can capture lynx that are 2 meters high, at the height of winter. So we leave them out all winter. We don't go back until, say, June or July when the snow melts, and we collect all the cameras and see what we got. And what, obviously what you're hoping for is lots of pictures that look like this, or maybe look like this. And then of course we pair that with the snow tracking visits we make all winter long on snowmobiles. Again, what you see here is one of our technicians. This is crappy, melted out snow conditions. He's wondering if these are lynx tracks or not, so he's digging out that compression signature to try to make sure. And we're looking for, these are what lynx tracks looks like. When we find tracks, we try our best to backtrack and collect genetic samples. That's usually scat, although in the past year, we started to switch over to eDNA. It's kind of nice. You can just pick up some snow from each print and then send that in, and they can get down to species from just that, which saves us a lot of backtracking. So that's what we're moving toward going forward, is eDNA. And I'll leave it at that. We'll get back to the results of some of this toward the end, just to give you a sense of where things sit. But realize that, this has been one of the big projects that we moved to once the reintroduction was, quote unquote, over and considered a success, was this long-term non-invasive monitoring stuff. I've been working on that for I don't know, 7-8 years now. Of course, things are never easy. There's always something. About the minute that we declared success, we realized that a lot of our subalpine forests were dying because of bark beetle outbreaks. Okay, so this is a picture from Wolf Creek Pass. What you see in the background there are most of the older, larger spruce trees dead because of spruce beetle. Okay, and of course, this was concerning to us. Lynx are a forest-dwelling species. They don't live anywhere else, and same with their primary prey. And so what happens then when you have this, very impactful perturbation on the landscape, that it's a huge perturbation, it's happening everywhere. What is the impact of that to lynx? So we needed to know and try to understand that, so we knew what to anticipate, and if there's anything we could do management-wise to help this out, we wanted to know what that was. So we embarked on a series of research projects to try to figure out what the impacts of this might be, and I wanted to share some of that with you as well in the last half of this talk. Just to give you a sense of the issue, this is a very simplistic map of subalpine forest habitat types in the state. So the blue polygons here, what we're most interested in, that's the spruce fir stuff that lynx really like to be in. We also looked a bit at the bright green stuff is mostly lodgepole pine, which lynx use from time to time, but certainly don't seem to prefer. If we overlay that with bark beetle outbreaks, here's what we get. This is what the world looked like as of 2014. So mountain pine beetle impacting lodgepole is in red. Spruce beetle impacting spruce fir is in purple. This is as of 2014, the last year we collected data on that project. And I think the main take home here is, my gosh, there's a lot of red and there's a lot of purple on that map. So this is a pretty extensive problem. In fact, if you add up all the red and all the purple, at that point in time, it was just north of 4 million acres. Mountain pine beetle, in my sense, has basically played itself out. It has eaten all the lodgepole there is really to eat. But the spruce beetle has continued to expand. I think if I downloaded this data today, you would see that we're pushing probably closer to 4.5 million acres impacted by beetles. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal in terms of sheer aerial extent that is being impacted. It's a big deal in terms of what's happening on the ground underneath those red and purple polygons. But basically, they only kill the larger, older trees, so you're taking off the overstory, letting a lot of light into the understory, and basically hitting the reset button on succession. So our question is that a big deal? Is that a problem? Is that a good thing? How does that impact lynx and their prey? So one of the first things we did is actually just coincidentally another camera-based occupancy survey. So here's a map of everywhere we sampled. We put out 300 cameras and sampled for a couple of years in both spruce fir habitat and lodgepole habitat to try to get kind of a 30,000 foot look at, which wildlife species actually thrive in this kind of perturbation, which do not do well at all, and which don't seem to care. And clearly, a couple of species we were really interested in were snowshoe hares and red squirrels, from a lynx standpoint. Okay, so let's take a look at that. There's a fair amount going on here, so let me walk you through these series of figures. We have occupancy estimates on the y-axis. Think of this as probability of use of a particular stand, okay? And we're generally showing you that as a function of the x-axis being years since outbreak, okay, which is color-coded from green to silver. So the design of the study is we sampled all the way across that gradient. So we sampled lots of stands that were green, that hadn't been hit by beetles yet at all. Those are on the far left. We also sampled stands that had been hit by beetles, you know, more than a decade before we got there. And those are over here on the far right. Those are the silver stands. Generally, the progression is stands get hit by beetles, the needles start to turn pretty deep red, years 1 through 3, and then the needles fall off, and you just have sort of a silver-looking forest out here. So hopefully the color bar is useful as well. We've also sort of looked at this in an interaction framework with the severity of the beetle outbreak in the upper right. Okay, so beetles are like fire. Not every beetle outbreak in every stand is the same. Sometimes they move over an area and one stand gets hit really hard and the next stand doesn't get hit as hard. So this is estimated occupancy of snowshoe hares through time since outbreak, and sort of a light severity kind of a case. Only 10% of the overstory is dead. The blue here is occupancy of hares in spruce fir. That's what we're most interested in. As you can see, it's estimated to be higher than it is in the gray, which was the lodgepole stratum, which is not a surprise. Spruce fir is much better habitat for hares. I expected, based on what we know about hares, like death and taxes, we know for certain that hares are tied to understory cover. That is one of the best predictors, very solid relationship between those two things. And my thought was that, well, understory cover has to go up, and therefore hare use ought to go up as well. I did not find that though. If anything, those lines are pretty flat and maybe even tail off, you know, out here at the end. We look at the fitted model for a moderate severity kind of case where 50% of the overstory is dead, still just kind of a flat line in both habitat types. In a high severity case where 90% of the overstory is dead, it's still just basically a flat line. Maybe some of these mean lines here are starting to tilt upward, but not really. It's basically no relationship there, which surprised me. It's possible that it's just going to take longer than a decade. You know, if we were able to expand this figure out beyond 10 years to 20 years, maybe we would get more of a relationship. But for now, I don't see much there. So it isn't a good thing for hares like I thought it would be, but it certainly doesn't seem to be detrimental to hares either. Red squirrels are a different story. Okay, we do the same analysis for red squirrels in a sort of light, low severity kind of case. Their response is just a flat line, both in the spruce fir and in the lodgepole systems. Overall occupancy is high. You can walk into almost any stand in the state, and if you sit there long enough, you'll see a squirrel, is what that means. But it's a different sort of story when you look at a moderate severity kind of a stand. What we start to see is there's maybe the beginnings of a drop in occupancy right here between years 3 and 4 when those needles drop. And if we look at a high severity kind of case, the fitted models suggest that drop is even steeper. Now again, occupancy is a coarse metric. There isn't, you know, I don't have great precision here. These confidence intervals are fairly wide, but the mean fit of this does suggest that occupancy declines from 0.8 in a green stand down to maybe 0.6-ish in a severely hit stand. That's a difference of 0.2. 0.2 out of 0.8 is a quarter. This would suggest that, at least the mean would suggest that about a quarter of the stands that used to have squirrels in them don't after beetles go by and impact that pretty severely. So if that's true, then that's a fairly big impact. And that makes sense. We know ecologically that red squirrels are tied heavily to their middens and to these cone crops to get them through the winters. Most of the cone crop comes from those older mature trees. So if you take out the mature trees and you don't have cones, then survival of red squirrels goes down. We know that. And I think that's probably the mechanism at play here. So decent news from a hare standpoint, not so good news from a red squirrel standpoint, but overall I was also a little worried that this is a coarse metric that occupancy can sort of mask underlying changes in abundance as well. And that worried me a bit. So for instance, you might envision a stand A could have 1 hare in it, and after beetles it has 10 hares in it. But from an occupancy standpoint, both of those stands, before and after, are occupied. So you might expect occupancy not to change, but abundance certainly could. So to check myself and make sure that we weren't missing anything, we went back and looked at exactly that. So we went from a very extensive sampling scheme with a kind of a rough metric to very intensive sampling with a much more precise metric. Okay, so we looked at the numerical response of these 2 species to spruce beetles in the southwest part of the state. But here's a study area for that. It's a little bit of a busy figure, but the study sites are these 15 red circles. This is down in the San Juans again, basically from Del Norte down to Durango. The different sort of color ramped, yellow to brown color ramped polygons are the beetles, okay? So brown polygons are places that were hit by beetles a long time ago. Yellow polygons are places that were hit by beetles not very long ago. And then notice that we have these 3 stands out here by Telluride that are basically, there's no yellow or brown at all in those places. Those are our quote unquote control. So again, we're sampling across this gradient of time since beetles and looking to see if that has any impact on measured density this time instead of occupancy. And we did, intensive mark recapture kinds of things in each of these 15 places to try to figure this out. What we found for hares, okay, this is basically the same figure, except now I have hare density on the y-axis instead of occupancy, but again, graphed against years since outbreak. And again, that is basically a flat line. Okay, so the occupancy estimate wasn't really lying to me. There really doesn't seem to be much change in hare density through time. Again, it's a bit perplexing to me. I would expect it to go up, but clearly that isn't the case, at least within the first decade. What we did find, one of the few variables that was significantly related to hare density is this one, and this is basically stem density, trees per acre of small diameter subalpine fir. So again, we have rediscovered for the umpteenth time that the thing that really matters to hares is that understory cover. You get high stem density of young conifers, you get more hares. So what this indicates to me is still what structures hare density across our landscape is the plot to plot or stand to stand differences in potential productivity and differences in understory cover. It's more driven by that than it is by this overarching response to beetles, per se. Red squirrels, the best fitting model look like this. So sort of, again, corroborates what we had found with the occupancy stuff. Fair bit of uncertainty early on in this time series kind of thing, but it does tail off pretty good. And the slope of that line is significant. Those confidence intervals do not include 0 on that. It's a pretty significant decline, actually. You're talking about 10 hares per hectare in a control site down to 2 squirrels per hectare 10 years out after beetles. So that's a decline of 80% or whatever. That's a pretty big deal. So again, confirmed what the occupancy analysis has told us previously. It wasn't lying that this is not that big a deal for hares, which is good news. It might be a much bigger deal for red squirrels. And if you remember back to what I told you earlier, that is potentially a big deal for lynx, okay? Because in those points in time when hares cycle downward, and we are right now in the middle of a trough, okay? So hare numbers are as low as they're going to be right this second. My question is, given the bark beetle activity, are there still enough red squirrels out there to support lynx and get them through until the hares come back? Could easily be, there aren't as many squirrels as there used to be, but maybe there's still enough. That could be. Maybe there's too few, and we start to see some impacts in terms of lynx survival. I'm not sure. I guess we're poised to find out. But that's, you know, the one worry I have about the bark beetle issue is what happens when the secondary prey isn't as abundant as it used to be. To follow up on that, a third study we did was in collaboration with John Squires with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And here we actually put collars back on lynx and measured lynx use of these areas to figure out and see exactly how they were using these beetle-impacted places. Okay, so the study area for this is this black outlined polygon here on the Rio Grande National Forest mostly. We collared as many lynx as we could, followed them around, got very precise locations every 15 minutes, and did a lot of habitat selection kinds of analyses. But just to give you a sense of, you know, the raw data, this is what it looks like. So the different colored dots are different lynx. The yellowish brown polygons underneath this are all beetle impacted timber. So right away, you know, the very first time we downloaded data, we're like, well, I mean, the lynx certainly don't seem to mind the beetle impacted stuff. They're all over that. One thing they do seem to mind, the red polygon here is the West Fork fire. Okay, that seems to be sort of a wall, an impenetrable wall that lynx aren't willing to go into. That's a different story. But in terms of beetles, right from the get-go, we had the inclination that it wasn't going to be that much of a problem for lynx. Here's an example of some of the data that we got from that, just a quick summary, and I want you to focus on the panel to the right. What we have here is stem density, average stem density, okay? At the bluish bars are a sample of GPS locations for each of these individual lynx, okay? So the blue bars are, for each lynx, is the stem density at use sites. And for comparison, the orangey red bars are, or pinkish red, whatever that is, salmon, is the stem density at random sites within their home range. And what you see in the winter here on this right-hand side is those blue bars are almost always bigger than the red bars, and in some cases much bigger. So what you're seeing there is selection in its rawest form, right? These cats are choosing to be in places with higher stem density of ABLA, ABLA alpine fir, than places that occur randomly in their home range. The exact same story that we found with hares, the exact same story that other folks have found in other places in lynx range. So confirmed that, you know, lynx here sort of act like lynx other places, and lynx in a post-beetle world sort of act like lynx in a pre-beetles world. More evidence of that, if we look at our study area and overlay that on the lynx use map I showed you way at the beginning, that was pre-beetles. 99 to 2011 is when we did the reintroduction stuff. And we compare that same area to the more sophisticated habitat selection map that we built from 2015 to 2017, which is post-beetles. Obviously, there's differences in technology and precision in the statistical approaches that we used here. But what you can see is there's a big red blob of high intensity lynx use on this left-hand map, just west of Lake City, and pre-beetles. In post-beetles, you know, it's a much clearer picture, but here's this big red blob of high intensity lynx use over here, same place. Similarly, this red blob here is that upper Rio Grande reservoir area that I showed you in one of those slides. And over here, much more precise picture, but here's the Rio Grande Reservoir and a lot of lynx, heavy lynx use in that same area. Same blob, same place, pre and post beetles. Same here, the pinkish stuff is the fire. The fire is out, but there's a big blob of lynx use south of Creed, and here it is over here, post beetles still south of Creed. The South San Juans are maybe a little different. This red blob of heavy lynx use seems to have shifted a little bit north, but I think the story still stands that from a hare perspective, from a lynx perspective, there hasn't been any big drastic changes on the landscape as a result of beetles, which is good. I'm not sure that's what we necessarily expected, but that's what we found, and I can certainly live with that outcome. Okay, so let's wrap up and give you a sense of where we're at now in terms of the long-term monitoring and how things are shaping up for this population in the years since we ended the reintroduction. So Here we are again looking aerially at the San Juan Mountains. All of the colored squares you see here are the sample of units that we visit every year and try to determine whether there are lynx there or not and fit our occupancy model to those data. The darker the green, so the color ramp goes from gray in places that these are units we've never ever detected lynx in. Yellow, we've detected lynx in 1 year, maybe 2 years out of the 5 that we've been doing this now officially. And then the darkest green are places where we get lynx every single year. You can see there's certainly a band of heavy, consistent lynx activity sort of along the spine of the San Juans here, where we find them all the time, which is encouraging. We find them year in and year out. We fit the occupancy model through time, and I threw on the 2010 research data that we had when we were trying to figure this out as well. I've labeled this population trend, realize it isn't really population trend. We're not measuring abundance here, but it's really a trend in occupancy. But as you can see, there hasn't been too drastic of a change in those occupancy estimates through time. There's maybe a few upticks apparently in occupancy out here, but honestly, I think those are artifacts of other things that have happened, unfortunately, and logistic-wise in our sampling, more so than changes in occupancy, actual occupancy of lynx. So the way I read this is things look fairly stable, okay? We haven't seen occupancy increase dramatically at all, which is a bit of a bummer. But on the other hand, we haven't seen it shrink, okay? We just keep tending to find lynx in all the places we always used to find lynx, which on balance is a good outcome. So the future, what kinds of things do I worry about with respect to conservation of the species? Overarching theme here is probably climate change. We have predator species in its primary prey that are quite clearly very highly adapted to deep, soft snow environments. And as the earth warms, it seems like, that could be a problem eventually. But more proximately, we looked pretty heavily at the beetle thing that's happening now. I actually feel pretty decent about that. I think lynx have a good chance of weathering these dramatic beetle outbreaks pretty well. Again, the only thing I'm really worried about is, when we're in a trough of the snowshoe hare cycle like we are now, are there enough squirrels to sustain lynx? And we're going to find out real soon, but my sense is it's probably going to be okay. So I'm not as worried about beetles as I once was. Fire is the next thing that certainly I worry about a lot. As you can see on the news every night, fire can happen any point in time, and you can just in an instant lose 150,000 acres of good lynx habitat. And when that goes, it's gone for a long time. There's no getting that back, and it's really not of any utility to lynx at all when that stuff burns up. So that's something that I worry about in the near future as well. It's just that is such a wild card. It's hard to know when and if and how impactful that's going to be, but it's something that we're certainly worried about. Further down the road, like I mentioned, the number of days with snow cover is getting less and less all the time. That creates problems for hares because they get mismatched on each end of the winter season. They're brown when they're supposed to be white, and they're white when they're supposed to be brown, and that causes issues in terms of survival. Changes to snowpack and snow depth, I think, are probably stand to be detrimental to some degree, but we don't know exactly what the impacts of these are going to be. They're slow-moving variables, and I think the impacts of those are probably still further out into the future. Still mostly worried about fire and a little bit about beetle, but mostly fire in the near future. These are things that I worry about further down the line. And any other thing that I worry about down the line, we've done a fair bit of work that I didn't present today on lynx response to winter recreation, lynx response to highways. And there are some thresholds there. Lynx are actually fairly tolerant species. If winter recreation happens and it isn't at too high of a level, lynx can tolerate that just fine in their home range. But as the activity increases, they adapt more and more to that. They become a little bit more nocturnal. They become a little bit less active. Eventually, they just stop, avoid those areas of heavy use altogether. And, eventually down the road, maybe that becomes a problem. I don't think it's a huge issue right now. But man, I don't know where the human use thing actually ends in Colorado, especially when it comes to winter recreation. It just seems like we keep expanding ski areas. We keep finding more people to fill those expanded ski areas. Visitation goes up and up and up. Again, it's not something I'm worried about at the moment, but given that there doesn't seem to be an end to that, maybe at some point in some places that does become an issue for lynx. We'll see. So with that, I've filled up, I think, probably my 50 minutes or so. Hopefully you enjoyed the presentation, learned a few things. I'm happy to hang around as long as you want to try to answer any questions you might have.
Hi, Jake. Thank you so much. Would you mind stopping sharing your screen so that you can see it more?
Yep, for sure.
All right. So, Rudy, you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
And so we have plenty of time for questions for Jake, who gave a very detailed report about the current situation, maybe the future. It doesn't look that bad, but we might have concern for our lynx. So your questions, please, for Jake.
Hi, this is Nicole here. Thank you for a great presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question in regards to the winter recreation. I did think of that when you brought up the point in 2007 and 2008, the declining kittens. I was wondering if you thought there was a connection between the winter recreation in terms of backcountry skiing, because Silverton Resort opened in 2002, but they didn't start doing helicopter tours until that 2008. And the same thing happened with Telluride as well, which opens up the access to backcountry skiing and human presence in these areas. So I didn't know if maybe you thought that the stressor response could have lowered the reproductive stress or reproductive success of lynx.
I mean, it could be. That's a good point. It probably didn't help anything to have that extra stressor on the landscape. I do think my gut feeling is that it probably is mostly related to the lack of hares in those years. Not just what I found in my study area, but we had pellet plots going lots of other places, and the dearth of hare in those years kind of happened everywhere. So it probably didn't help, like you say, in Silverton and Telluride, but we have lots of lynx, lots of other places that also didn't produce any kittens during those years. So I think it's probably more than just that, but you're right, that probably wasn't that helpful to those individuals living right next to those activities.
Any other questions for Jake? Peter?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. I thought I really enjoyed your presentation, so thank you very much for that. One of the things I've always noticed about these introduction sort of projects is that the old problems crop up again. Like recently in Switzerland, they voted down, but it was a national referendum to allow people to shoot wolves, which was reintroduced a decade or I don't know how long ago exactly. But I was wondering what kind of pushback, if any, you've heard from like people in the area who are concerned about lynx showing up. Thank you.
As in, we have lynx now, and we didn't want them. We don't want them here anymore, or maybe there's too many of them. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, do people resist this idea of lynx being out there, or do you have any signs of people advocating to remove them again?
We really don't, at least not anymore. I wasn't around early on in this process, but the stories I've heard from the folks who were, certainly as we were getting started, there were those kinds of concerns from Wool Growers Association, from Cattlemen's Association, from the ski industry. What's going to happen now that you put this animal out here, the species, and now it's listed, so now every time we want to try to expand or paint a building, this is all going to be harder. So we heard complaints from those kinds of groups that lynx have potentially were going to make their lives harder. But honestly, you know, a lot of those concerns turned out to be unfounded, especially from the agricultural community. Those concerns died back pretty quickly. I mean, lynx live in this high country. They really only eat hares. They don't bother anything else. And so that died back pretty quickly. And we worked through a lot of issues with the ski industry. You know, some of the things they were trying to do, there was a lot more consultation. Their lives were a little more complicated and a bit harder for sure. But we were able to work with them, work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and try to streamline some of that stuff to make that a more reasonable process, I think. So we were able to come up with a list of activities that are sort of routine maintenance stuff that every ski area always wants to do, you know, routinely. And we just said, okay, so blanket, those activities are fine. There's no real threat to lynx if this is what you're trying to do. But if you want to expand the Breckenridge ski area by however many 1,000 acres and move up into the high country where lynx are, then that, yeah, you should consult about it and try to figure out if that's a good thing to do or not. So anymore, I don't sense much pushback at all. Maybe there's some out there, but I certainly don't hear it or don't sense it.
Thanks. Yeah, in Switzerland, it was some wolves would occasionally eat sheep, and
yeah,
people were getting upset by that. I don't want to hog the questions, but I do have a real quick one. What happened to the lynx that was found in Alberta? Was it trapped, or how did that end up for the lynx?
That didn't go well for the lynx. Yeah, I mean it was trapped and died in that trap, and as the trapper was collecting it and went to skin it, realized that it was collared, and that the collar had a name and an address and a phone number. But thankful that, you know, a lot of times when that happens, you know, people just sort of cut the collar and throw it in the trash, and you just would never know. But thankful that the guy at least gave a call, and we appreciated the information and sent him on his way.
Take a quick question. What is your estimate of individual lynx we have here in the state of Colorado?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I get that all the time. How many lynx do we have? And I usually try my best to just punt if I can on that. It's such a hard thing to know. I mean, we know we put 218 out there. That's what we know for sure. Trying to estimate the number we have would be pretty difficult given the analysis techniques that are available to us. I have, with gun to my head from the Fish and Wildlife Service, had to come up with some estimates in the past, and I've tried to come at that a couple of different ways. On the low end, I think there's probably 75 or so. On the high end, maybe 200-ish, something like that. But those are really, really rough guesstimates. Some of it based on our occupancy models and saying, well, if every occupied cell had one lynx in it, what would we have? Or if it had two lynx in it, you know, what would we have? Some of that based on, you know, other projecting our growth rate out into the future to now, where would we be? You know, those sorts of things is what I've tried to do. Just pretty loose, but those are my guesses.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jay?
Yes. How much, or have you had much evidence of dispersal from other populations, like in Wyoming or Montana, of lynx coming and staying in Colorado?
That's a great question. Obviously, we've had a lot of evidence, because we had every single lynx collared at one point, of lynx moving from here to there. What we've never ever had any evidence of, collar-wise or genetics-wise, is movement in the other direction. So that we know of, we've never had a lynx from, say, Montana make it to Colorado. Yep.
Lisa had a question. Lisa?
Oh, thanks, Rudy. Yeah, I just wanted to say I loved this talk, and I confess to being a little distracted because at 4 p.m. is childcare hour.
Oh, yeah,
so,
yeah.
I'm taking notes by crayon. But this was such a demonstration of like the value of longitudinal and focused data, and I really loved the talk. And I guess my question is if you have any more thoughts on the changing fire regimes and how they alter connectivity or sort of other issues that come up. You know, I'm thinking of the Cameron Peak fire and the Mullen fire.
Yeah, you know, I'm not a fire ecologist. I'm on a few science teams with folks who are. I wish I knew more about that, but my sense in listening to them talk is that, boy, every year is just kind of a roll of the dice, given their current conditions. You know, you may get enough snow and it may be fine and you may be out of the woods, but I think the probability of big, severe fires, at least relative to what's happened historically, is elevated now compared to what it was, which is probably not a good thing. And maybe we roll the dice 50 times in a row, and the next 50 years nothing bad happens, and lynx persists. But it could be next year that we have a 200,000 acre fire and impacts that Silverton area or the area west of Creede and Upper Rio Grande, and that would really, really, really put a dent in our lynx population. But I wish I knew more. I wish I could predict better where it might happen or when it's going to happen, but I don't know how to do that. But certainly a concern that I have, because that can happen fast. And like I say, when it does, it's just those areas are just zeros for lynx for a long time at that point.
Rudy,
You have a question? Yeah.
yeah, I have a quick question. Jake, thank you for the really interesting presentation. I may have missed this at the beginning. I missed the first few minutes of your talk. I was just curious what your group's sort of the mission is, sort of what is the overarching goal that you're trying to achieve? And that's kind of question one. And I'm curious to know the answer to that question in the context of, I mean, you've pointed to several things that are ongoing, changing mountain pine beetle fires, changing snow regime, changing temperature. How do you achieve those goals and objectives in sort of a period when baselines are constantly shifting and what people would have been striving for or to return to 30, 40, 50 years ago now looks a lot different? I'm just curious how your organization deals with this idea of shifting baselines,
Yep.
changing goals and objectives.
Yeah. Well, one of the first slides I had put up, one of the reasons that we undertook this project was our mission, and I won't get it exactly right, is conservation of native wildlife species in this state. That's one of the things that we're mandated to try to do. We got to keep those native species around. So that's part of why we exist. The mission statement is bigger than that, obviously. Recreation and hunting and that kind of thing is another big part of why we exist, but just conservation of native species is a big piece of it, and that's one of the drivers of why we did what we did here. But the changing baselines, boy, I to be perfectly honest, our agency, I think probably a lot of entities really struggle with that. I don't know what to do about that. It's so hard to predict what's going to happen. And then we're so slow moving to respond to stuff. The beetle thing happened, and by the time we got ramped up and completed, the three sort of related research projects, 6-7 years has passed, and everything we thought we learned is, we learned it. It's still applicable, but the landscape looks so much more different now than even when we started those research projects. So it's hard to be nimble enough to address that stuff. If you have any great ideas, let me know. I feel like we're always behind. we can think of things we need to know, but by the time we get down to actually executing those and getting answers, we're behind the next question again.
Gregory does a lot of research on the impacts of fire. So that is probably a major question for you, I think.
Absolutely.
Looking at
Yeah.
the Cameron fire and near Fort Collins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Brian had a question, Brian Wee. Didn't you raise your arm? No.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Rudy.
Yeah.
Jake, that was a great presentation. Thank you very much for being here with us. And it's funny because as you're talking about telemetry, I thought back to my days as a grad student when I was doing radio telemetry for hairy woodpeckers out in Washington. And after spending a year doing that work, I have never seen or looked at a woodpecker the same way again. That has, at least for me, this affinity for the thing that I was studying. And the question I have for you is, in this amount of time that you've spent working with reintroducing, studying the Canadian lynx, have you developed a particular sort of relationship with the species that you're investigating? And if you have, what is that? And what has it been like for you as a researcher?
Yeah, I think I don't know about a relationship, but one thing that strikes me all the time in doing this field work is just sheer respect for how hard that life is. When you strap on snowshoes and start following lynx around, that's incredible. That's some of the hardest work I've ever done. You know, I mean, I remember the first time I'm originally from Michigan, and the first time I came out here and started following lynx, you know, I was gassed after the first 2 hours, and all I did is, you know, climb up a few hundred feet basically to the top of this ridge, and I got to the top, and you can tell by the gait of the lynx, it's just loping along like it's no big deal. And I got to the top and looked down, and it went straight down the other side, and I could see it went straight up the next ridge, and I thought, oh my God, like I'm going to die just trying to follow what this cat did. And that's just a day in the life of that cat. Like, I don't think it means much to them at all. But just the conditions out there, like in the amount of ground they can cover, man, it gets, you know, pretty cold out there at times. There isn't much out there. I mean, there's a few hares out there, there's a few grouse out there, but it's a pretty bleak existence. So I guess in my answer to that is I've always just been sort of in awe and respectful of that. Well, for all wildlife. I mean, you know, life in nature is hard, but that really hit me as to how hard it was when I started working more closely with these individuals. And some of them you do get to know. You know, you follow the same females every reproduction season, and you realize, you know, where they live, and wow, this den is right next to the den we were at last year. One interesting, rewarding thing is we sort of, you know, took a bunch of time off from the end of the reintroduction until I was working with John Squires on the bark beetle project in the Rio Grande. And he ended up catching several of our old caps, still had old collars on them. I'm like, wow, they're still out here. This is like 14 years after we reintroduced them, and they're still here. And one of them, we had an opportunity. It's like, yeah, man, it looks like this female is den. I'm like, man, you have to be kidding me. Like, that's an old cat. And sure as heck, we went out there and found a den. I came back and plotted it. It was 30 meters from the last time I had been to see her, you know, 10 years ago. So stuff like that. It's like, you know, my life has been pretty easy in Fort Collins for the last 10 years, and she's been out there busting her butt and raising kittens every year. Beetles are not in the same drainage. So those kinds of things I think are, you know, interesting to think about. I don't know what that means scientifically, but it's pretty fun.
Thank you. Thanks, Jake.
Mm-hmm. More questions for Jake? Anybody else?
Looks like Raphael might have a question.
Okay, yeah, Raphael.
Thank you. Thank you, Jake. Again, thank you for that great presentation. A question, before, during, and after the introduction of the Lynx, did you, was there a study related to the structuring and documenting the social perceptions and preferences regarding the introduction of the Lynx?
No. Nope. At that point in time, that whole idea, as I heard it, was hatched on a river trip by a few biologists and their supervisors, and it sort of grew from there. And our director got on board, and it just kind of happened. We just did it. Whether that's the best way to do it or not, I don't know. But one result is we have lynx on the landscape. Now, we've been working a lot, as you probably heard, to try to reintroduce wolverine as the next species we've been trying to work on. We learned a lot from the Lynx Reintroduction. One of the things we learned is that, you know, maybe it would be better to do a bunch of this outreach kind of stuff that you're talking about before we do all that, especially given that, you know, one of the things that happened that we weren't planning on, that was kind of a bummer with lynx, is we started to put them all out there, and then they got listed. Okay, so then it's like, man, you know, the state of Colorado just put this listed species problem in our backyard. Like, that sucks. And given that that's a possibility for wolverine, we've been working with a lot of stakeholder groups through the years and trying to figure out what their concerns are, how we can allay those concerns, what kind of agreements can we get into, that sort of thing. So we're trying to work more of those angles for the wolverine thing. That certainly slows things down, makes things harder. There's a lot more people that have to agree on things, but we're trying to do that. On the other hand, we still don't have wolverine on the ground either. So maybe we should just do it. I don't know.
Thank you, Jake.
Any other question for Jake? Tom, yeah.
Yeah, Jake, so I'll echo all the other sentiments about how great this presentation was. I'm also a University of Montana alum, so it's good, good to see somebody here from there. So I'm just curious, with regard to our students, if somebody kind of thought to themselves that this was a really interesting topic, you know, how do you suggest that they get involved with this type of work, either through internships or other types of kind of venues?
Right. So, you know, I still hire pretty big crews every year. I'm doing a lot of snowshoe hare research. Unfortunately, we aren't trapping hares. It isn't as glamorous of work, but it's still super important wildlife work. And we all sort of advertise on the Texas A&M website for those positions. So if folks are interested in like a job, that those advertisements will come out like in March, and those positions generally run, you know, June, July, August, basically through the summer. So that's a possibility for sure. A lot of the monitoring stuff that's ongoing has been taken over by our permanent staff. So that was a decision that was made, you know, that's how we were going to try to handle that. When I was doing the research and trying to figure it out, I was hiring students and folks to help do that. But that's all been taken over by permanent folks. If there's a real interest there, we can certainly try to work folks in if they want to, you know, volunteer for a day or two or something like that. It's much easier on the camera side. If you're into hiking and want to hike a long ways into the Weminuche and hang a camera or go get one, that can be arranged. The snow tracking stuff is harder. It's all kind of weather dependent, and then you got to have a machine and know how to use it and all that kind of stuff. But there are certainly some opportunities out there.
Any last questions or comments?
I did have a question about the methodology on that. As far as the non-invasive monitoring, is there any reason that you're not using hare snares?
You know, there is. We tried that early on, because right when I was taking over this work is when the National Lynx Monitoring Protocol came out, and that's all about hare snares. So we put hare snares out in a test sort of fashion, you know, in places where we still knew we had lynx on the air. We could see where they were moving, and we put hare snares out and sort of tried to figure out, can we detect these animals that we know are here? And we didn't have much luck with that. And we would go back and check the hare snares and get nothing, and go back the next week and get nothing, and go back the next week and get nothing. You're like, man, how, you know, why is this not working? And that's actually how we got into cameras. We started putting cameras up on the hare snares to try to get an idea of why isn't this working? You know, what's happening? And what we found is that for whatever reason, our lynx in Colorado would come to those hare snare stations. You know, the visual lures and the olfactory lures would work well enough to get them to come there, and they would sniff around the hare snare and even rub on it a little bit, but apparently just not quite enough to leave us anything that we could use in terms of a genetic sample. And we kept trying to make that work, and then finally realized it's like, you know, it's easy enough to get lynx to come to a tree and take a picture of them. Maybe we should just go with that instead. And so that's ultimately what we went with. I think the hare snare thing is great. If you can do it, you can get better information, more detailed information, if you can get the genetic stuff. We just never felt confident enough that we could. And we got a few samples here and there, but I just never felt confident that we can make that work well on a large scale. Maybe we should revisit it or change the hare snag somehow. We never really, you know, went that far with it, but that's kind of how we ended up with cameras and snow tracking and not hare snares.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Jake. We're getting close to 5 o'clock, I think, or past 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for a great presentation. Very interesting theme. Let me mention that we plan a second event with our college, CLS, a more general information afternoon with colleagues of yours from the White River National Forest. And they were actively involved with you on research on the lynx habitat at the Vail Pass area.
Right.
Which is a little bit closer to us than the San Juans. And hopefully we can organize that. That would be in March or April. And it would be a joint afternoon event. So I wanted to mention this. If there aren't any questions, then thanks again for a great, highly interesting presentation on an animal we started to like a lot.
Great.
Okay,
well,
thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Good. Thank you.
Mhm.
Then
Bye, everybody.
we close.